The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of conversation as people settled into the wooden benches. A clock ticked loudly above the judge's bench, marking the start of another Monday in the city's overworked criminal court. The heavy doors creaked open, drawing glances toward the back of the room. Dante Cole stepped inside. Tall, focused, and dressed in a second-hand suit that didn't quite fit at the shoulders, he carried a worn leather briefcase pressed tightly to his side. His shoes were polished, but the soles were nearly worn through, an unspoken testimony to the miles he had walked to get here. His gaze didn't waver. He had memorized every detail of this courtroom before arriving. Now it was time to speak for someone who couldn't speak for himself. Marcus Cole, his older brother, sat handcuffed at the defense table. His eyes met Dante's with quiet trust, but also fear. Not fear of guilt. Marcus knew he hadn't stolen anything. His fear was of a system that didn't often listen to men who looked like them. But Dante had made him a promise, that he would not let this courtroom forget Marcus's humanity. At the bench sat Judge Eleanor Wexler, dignified, sharp, and known for running a strict court, a woman whose name commanded respect across the city's legal circles. She glanced over her reading glasses at Dante, her expression unreadable at first. Then she squinted, as if trying to assess who exactly he was. Dante approached the front with purpose, placing his documents on the table. "Your Honor," he began clearly, "I'm representing the defendant, Marcus Cole, as a pro-se advocate under Statute 28 U.S.C. Cat 1 Scene 54. Wexler raised an eyebrow. "You're not an attorney?" "No, ma'am, but I am certified as a legal researcher, and I've prepared all documents in accordance with the court's procedures." She leaned forward, her voice sharp and cool. "I see. Mr. Cole, I hope you understand this courtroom is not a place for performances. The law is not a theatre." A few attorneys on the other side of the room chuckled quietly. The bailiff smirked without hiding it. One woman in the gallery shook her head in disapproval. The mood was clear. They didn't take him seriously. But Dante didn't flinch. He stood straight and responded calmly. "With respect, Your Honor, neither is it a place for assumptions." Wexler's eyes narrowed. A pause filled the courtroom like pressure in the air before a storm. She studied him for another long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, let's proceed. But you'd best be ready, Mr. Cole. This court has no patience for unprepared men." Dante returned to his seat beside his brother. Marcus whispered, "You sure about this, D?" Dante looked him in the eye and whispered back, "I've never been more sure of anything." The hearing was about to begin, but for Dante Cole, it wasn't just about proving Marcus innocent. It was about proving that justice didn't wear a name tag. It lived in preparation, courage, and the refusal to be silenced. The courtroom lights hummed above, but Dante's mind had already drifted back to the night everything changed. It had been a chilly evening, just after sunset, when Marcus stepped out to grab dinner for the family. He left with nothing but his hoodie, phone, and $20 in cash. The small corner diner was just a block away, a place they'd trusted for years. But that night, across the street, a robbery was unfolding at a nearby pawn shop. A man in a dark hoodie had smashed the window and fled before anyone could see his face clearly. When the sirens roared minutes later, Marcus had just stepped out of the diner with 2 steaming paper bags in his hands. He turned around, confused by the sudden chaos, only to find himself surrounded by flashing lights and drawn weapons. A cop yelled at him to get on the ground. Another tore the bags from his hands. One of them shoved his phone to the pavement as he was cuffed. Dante had witnessed it all from their porch. He'd seen his brother walking calmly, bags swinging at his side, and then, moments later, watched him slammed against the squad car as if he were the criminal. Their little sister, Alana, barely 6 at the time, cried out, "What are they doing to Marcus?" as she clutched Dante's waist. Their mother ran out barefoot, pleading with the officers. "He didn't do anything. He just went for food." But none of the officers stopped. None of them asked for witnesses. None of them reviewed the diner's time-stamped receipt sitting neatly in Marcus's pocket. They had a vague description: black male, hoodie, average height, and in their minds, Marcus had fit. That night, after the squad car disappeared down the block, silence took over the house. Not even the TV played. Alana fell asleep, crying in her mother's arms, still wearing her school backpack. Dante sat alone in his kitchen, the uneaten dinner getting cold on the table. Rage burned through him, but deeper than that, helplessness. He was only 19 at the time, no law degree, no power. Just a younger brother watching his protector be dragged away like a criminal. But even then, something shifted. He pulled out an old notebook and scribbled down everything he had witnessed: time, location, officer badge numbers, anything he could recall. He stayed up until dawn reading articles online, how false arrests happen, what rights they had, what legal recourse existed. By the time the sun rose, he wasn't just angry, he was ready. His mother found him hours later, still at the table, surrounded by scribbled notes and court articles printed from the library down the street. "You need to sleep, baby," she said softly. "I need to get Marcus home," he replied without looking up. That day, Dante made a silent vow, not just to defend Marcus, but to learn every law, every precedent, and every protection that could keep what happened to his brother from ever happening again. Back in the present, as the court proceedings stirred to life, Dante glanced briefly at Marcus beside him. No chains could shackle what they shared, because this wasn't just one man on trial. It was a family reclaiming its voice from a system that had too often silenced it. The silence of the city's public library became Dante's second home. Long after the sun went down, and most of the world had gone to sleep, he sat beneath flickering fluorescent lights, surrounded by dusty law books and old case files. The air always smelled faintly of paper and ink, comforting, grounding. It wasn't law school, but it was enough for a mind hungry for justice. After high school, Dante had watched his peers leave for colleges he couldn't afford. Scholarships had slipped through his fingers, not because he lacked the grades, but because he had chosen to stay close to his family, especially Marcus. Their neighborhood didn't offer many options. Most either left, hustled, or faded into the system. Dante chose something else entirely. He took a night job as a janitor at a local community center. It didn't pay much, but it gave him access to the building's tiny legal library, computer room, and most importantly, time. From a midnight to dawn, when the floors were clean and the halls silent, Dante read. He started with the Constitution, printing out sections and annotating them like sacred text. Then came Gideon v. Wainwright, Brown versus Board of Education, Miranda v. Arizona. He read about racial bias in jury selection, about due process, about Fourth Amendment rights. His notebooks were filled with case summaries, arguments, statutes, loopholes, and procedural guides. He subscribed to legal YouTube channels where professors explained courtroom strategy and the structure of arguments. When others scrolled social media, Dante scrolled court opinions. He wrote practice motions and memorized objections. He saved every dollar he could until he was finally able to register for a certified paralegal program at a local vocational school. It wasn't a law degree, but it was the key to the door most people assumed would stay locked to someone like him. At the end of the program, he passed the exam and received a certificate in legal research and court documentation. More importantly, he earned credibility, not in the eyes of the system, but in the mirror. He was no longer just a brother trying to help. He was a man equipped with the tools to fight. When Marcus was arrested, Dante didn't just react emotionally. He opened a binder already prepared with pre-written defense strategies. He had already studied bias in suspect identification, the weight of circumstantial evidence, and the right to a fair lineup process. He knew that if even one piece of evidence had been ignored, It could cast doubt over the entire case. He submitted discovery requests to obtain video footage, reviewed arrest logs, and filed a motion for pre-trial dismissal citing State v. Harrell, where a case had been thrown out due to lack of probable cause and misidentification. He found a legal precedent for every misstep the prosecution had taken. He even found and printed a rare case, State v. Kilburn, 1998, where racially motivated assumptions led to a wrongful conviction overturned by the appellate court. He highlighted every paragraph. That one would become the cornerstone of Marcus's defense. Each page, each statute, each late night in the library had led to this moment. Most people prepared for court with a team of lawyers. Dante came with nothing but his own research, his sleepless nights, and a quiet fire inside him. He didn't just want to win. He wanted to prove, especially to Marcus, that even without a badge, a title, or a degree, a man could still rise and speak law into a system that never expected to hear it from him. He wasn't trained by the system. He was forged by necessity. And when he walked into that courtroom, he brought with him not just the fight of a brother, but the wisdom of a hidden legal mind. The courtroom had grown still, the usual chatter and shuffling replaced by a dense anticipation. Dante stood at the center, legal binder in one hand, eyes locked on the lead arresting officer seated in the witness stand. "Officer Reynolds," Dante began, his tone polite but piercing, "you stated in your report that my brother, Marcus Cole, matched the description of the suspect fleeing the pawn shop on East 45th at approximately 8:30 p.m, I'm correct?" The officer nodded confidently. He was black male, average height, dark hoodie. Dante didn't flinch. "And how many other individuals matched that vague description in a 2-block radius at that exact moment?" Reynolds hesitated. "I don't have that figure. Because you never checked." Dante stepped closer. "In fact, you didn't review any of the nearby businesses' surveillance cameras before making the arrest, did you?" "I didn't need to," the officer replied defensively. "He was near the scene and ran when we approached." Dante nodded slowly. "Did you ask if he was carrying anything?" "He had bags. We assumed it was stolen." Dante held up a printed photo. Marcus outside the diner, time-stamped 8:28 p.m., holding 2 takeout bags. He handed a copy to the judge and jury. "Those were our family's dinner, paid in cash. The receipt is in evidence." There was a pause. Dante let it hang in the air. "Now," he continued, "can you tell the court why no effort was made to verify the alibi Marcus offered during the arrest?" Reynolds looked uncomfortable. "We didn't have time to verify right away, but you had time to cuff him, process him, and charge him without confirming even one piece of exculpatory evidence." The officer opened his mouth to respond, but Dante cut him off with a second printed image. A still from a grocery store's CCTV camera across town, time-stamped 8:33 p.m. Marcus was clearly visible at the checkout counter. Dante turned to the courtroom. "That location is over a mile from the scene of the robbery, and according to GPS records from the store's security system, Marcus was there minutes after the crime took place. There was no possible way for him to have committed the robbery and arrived at the store in that time frame." A few jurors leaned forward, whispering. Even some of the prosecution team seemed rattled. The prosecutor stood, clearly flustered. "Your Honor, this doesn't disprove proximity to the original crime. Our arresting officers made a reasonable assessment based on the circumstances." Dante pivoted to the judge. "With respect, Your Honor, reasonable assessment does not override constitutional rights. An arrest without verified evidence, based purely on race and location, is not reasonable. It is reckless." Judge Wexler's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're asserting racial bias in the arrest?" "Yes, Your Honor," Dante replied clearly. "I'm referencing State v. Kilburn, 1998, where an arrest based solely on matching racial descriptors, without confirmed evidence or investigative due diligence, was deemed unconstitutional, page 217. Paragraph 3 of the ruling. There was a moment of silence. Judge Wexler blinked. That case wasn't frequently cited. It had been buried under decades of newer rulings and rarely surfaced in court. She instinctively reached for her annotated casebook and flipped through the pages. Sure enough, Kilburn was there, exactly where Dante had said. She didn't speak for a few seconds. Her expression, usually so poised and unwavering, shifted subtly but unmistakably. Dante stood still, not pressing the moment. He didn't have to. The weight of his words was doing the work. "You're well prepared, Mr. Cole," she finally said, her tone flatter than before. "I had to be," Dante replied. "The system rarely offers a second chance to people like my brother. I wasn't about to waste the first." Murmurs moved through the gallery. Marcus watched, stunned, not because his brother had done what he said he would, but because he had done it better than anyone expected. For the first time, Judge Wexler looked at Dante not as a defiant amateur, but as something far rarer. A legal mind the courtroom never saw coming. The gavel had long been set down, the courtroom emptied. Yet Judge Eleanor Wexler remained seated in her chambers, unmoving. A cup of tea cooled beside her, untouched, the steam no longer rising. The walls around her were lined with shelves of law books, some as old as her career itself. Yet none of them held the answers to the questions echoing in her mind tonight. She stared blankly at a small frame photo on her desk. Her first day as a judge, freshly appointed in the early 1980s, wide-eyed and determined. A young woman in a room full of older, sterner men. Back then, she had thought fairness was something simple, written, in ink, bound in leather. You followed procedure, you applied precedent, and justice would prevail. But the world, she had learned, wasn't built in legal theories. It lived in faces, names, mistakes. Her thoughts drifted, uninvited, to a case she rarely allowed herself to revisit. A young black teen, no older than Dante, had stood before her bench nearly 4 decades ago. He had been accused of stealing a stereo system from a pawn shop. The case was thin, circumstantial, dependent on a shaky witness and police assumptions. But he had no real legal defense. No father in court, no skilled advocate. Only a public defender who mumbled his way through motions. She had sentenced him to 5 years in juvenile detention. The boy's mother had wept. The boy himself hadn't. He had just stared at her, eyes wide, disbelieving and betrayed. For years, she justified that ruling in her mind. I followed the law, I followed procedure. But watching Dante Cole today had cracked that shield of certainty. He had stood alone, no firm behind him, no law degree to lean on, armed with nothing but clarity, intelligence, and relentless preparation. And she had doubted him, not for his arguments, but from the moment he stepped into her court, because of his suit, his confidence, his skin. Was that bias? She hadn't meant it to be, but isn't that the very danger of it? She replayed the moment he had cited State v. Kilburn, a case even she hadn't remembered in full, and the way he delivered it, not to impress, but to defend, with quiet precision. She closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the smartest person in the room. Perhaps, she thought, the system didn't fail because of broken laws. Perhaps it failed because people like her believed they were incapable of failing. And perhaps, tonight, in a courtroom where everyone expected a young black man to fall short, she had witnessed someone quietly, powerfully shift the scale, not with rage, not with protest, but with law. The courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Word had spread about the self-taught young man defending his brother, about the footage, about the judge who was beginning to ask herself harder questions. Day 3 carried a different kind of energy, no longer mocking. Now, it was expectant. Dante stood once more, his binder thick with documents, hands steady as he approached the bench. The room quieted before he even spoke. "Your Honour, if I may," he began, "I'd like to present newly acquired evidence that was not reviewed by law enforcement prior to my brother's arrest or during preliminary investigations." He held up a signed affidavit. The paper creased at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. "This is a sworn statement from Mr. Ernesto Diaz, owner of a corner grocery located 5 blocks from the incident. He clearly recalls seeing Marcus Cole in his store, buying bottled water and bread at exactly 8:32 p.m., 3 minutes after the robbery occurred." He walked over to the clerk and handed her the copy to file. Mr. Diaz provided a time-stamped receipt and said no officer ever approached him, not during the arrest, not during follow-up. The prosecutor stirred in his seat, preparing to object, but Dante didn't stop. "And it doesn't end there." He held up a second document. "This is a log from the local precinct detailing the day police first accessed the CCTV footage I presented earlier. They received the footage 9 days ago, but it was never included in the evidence packet. No mention of it was made in their reports. No attempt was made to validate it or disprove it. That is not just oversight. That's borderline misconduct." Murmurs rippled across the gallery. Judge Wexler leaned forward, now fully engaged. "Mr. Cole, are you asserting suppression of exculpatory evidence?" "Yes, Your Honour. I'm asserting that the officers involved were either negligent or willfully ignored evidence that contradicted their assumptions." He turned to face the courtroom fully, voice firm but not angry. "Injustice isn't always loud. It's not always a shout or a slur. Sometimes it's the quiet omission of a video file, the silence of a witness ignored, the convenience of a case closed too quickly." He paused, then continued, his tone shifting from sharp to solemn. "I cite People v. Harrell, New York, 2011. A conviction was overturned because police failed to review video evidence from a nearby gas station, which ultimately proved the defendant's alibi. The court ruled that the failure to consider available surveillance constituted a denial of due process." A sharp intake of breath was heard from the row of attorneys behind the prosecution. Judge Wexler sat very still, eyes locked on Dante. There was no doubt in them now, only something that resembled respect, or maybe reckoning. She broke the silence. "Where did you learn all this?" Dante looked directly at her. "From the same constitution that's supposed to protect all of us, Your Honour." The room stayed quiet. No one smirked. No one whispered. Not this time. Marcus blinked slowly, his jaw clenched with emotion. This wasn't just a defense. It was an awakening. For the court, for the judge, for everyone watching a young man use the very tools that were once held against him to dismantle the walls they had built around his brother. Judge Wexler took a breath, sat back in her chair, and said simply, "We'll take a short recess. I need to review the new material." But the courtroom knew something had shifted, not just in the case, in her. The room was breathless. Everyone sat still, prosecutors, jurors, spectators. As Judge Eleanor Wexler returned from chambers, her black robe swayed gently as she stepped up to the bench. Her face gave nothing away. Stoic, unreadable, but heavier somehow, as though the past 3 days had carved something deep behind her eyes. Dante sat beside Marcus, hands folded on the table, jaw tight. Marcus stared ahead, not breathing, not blinking. Their mother clutched a tissue in the back row. Little Alana, now older but still small, held her mother's hand like a lifeline. Judge Wexler cleared her throat. The court clerk stood. "All rise." Everyone obeyed. Silence dropped like a curtain. Judge Wexler looked at the file before her, then at Marcus, then finally at Dante. Her voice, when it came, was measured, but with a current of something human beneath it. "This court has reviewed the full motion for dismissal the newly submitted affidavit, and the time-sensitive evidence that was overlooked by arresting officers. A pause. In light of this new evidence, and the clear procedural failures in the original investigation, this court finds that the charges against Marcus Cole shall be dismissed with prejudice. Gasps, audible cries from the back row. One juror covered her mouth. The court is further recommending that an internal investigation be conducted into the conduct of Officer Reynolds and his department, Wexler continued, specifically relating to evidence suppression, bias, and failure to conduct a complete investigation. The prosecutor sat back, defeated. No objections this time. Judge Wexler now looked directly at Dante. Her voice softened. Mr. Cole, when you first entered this courtroom, I questioned your place here. I questioned your qualifications. I questioned your ability to understand this process. She paused, eyes briefly flickering to the casebook stacked beside her. I misjudged you, and more than that, I underestimated what the law looks like when carried not by authority, but by truth. Today, you reminded this courtroom of something far more powerful than law. Justice. Dante didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat burned, but he nodded once, deeply, respectfully. Marcus turned and pulled him into a hug, tight, tearful, full of all the unspoken years between them. He whispered, "You did it, Dee. You brought me home." Their mother wept openly. Alana clapped without even realizing it, her hands small but full of meaning. The gavel struck once. Court is adjourned. But for the Cole family, it wasn't just the end of a trial. It was the end of a long, quiet war. And Dante had won, not by being louder or angrier or richer, but by being ready. He had walked in as a self-taught advocate. He was walking out as something far greater. The buzz of laughter and curiosity filled the modest community centre on Jackson Avenue. What once served as an afterthought of the city's budget was now the beating heart of something new. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and a whiteboard stood at the front of the room with a single phrase written in bold, hand-drawn letters, "Know your rights." Dante stood in front of the small crowd. About a dozen teens, a few young adults, some parents leaning in from the hallway. No suit today, just a t-shirt and jeans. But the presence he carried was even stronger now. He was animated, confident, drawing diagrams on the board as he explained how traffic stops worked, what due process really meant, how to request a lawyer, even if you couldn't afford one. His energy wasn't that of a lecturer. It was of someone who had walked the walk and wanted others to never have to run. One teen raised her hand, wide-eyed. "How do you remember all this stuff? Like, all those laws, all those cases?" Dante smiled. "Because the system doesn't expect us to know them," he said simply. "That's exactly why we must." The room nodded. They felt it. These weren't just lessons. They were armor. And for many in that room, it was the first time anyone had handed it to them. Unbeknownst to the crowd, someone had entered quietly during the session. She sat at the back of the room, out of sight. Judge Eleanor Wexler, dressed in plain grey slacks and a coat, hands folded in her lap, watching, listening. There was no announcement, no formal recognition, just quiet observation. She watched Dante with the same eyes that had once questioned him. But now, those eyes held something different: humility. As the session ended and kids slowly dispersed, some asking about next week's topic, Wexler waited until the room thinned out. Then she rose and approached the front. Dante noticed her as she came closer. For a moment, they both stood silent. Two people who had met under vastly different circumstances, yet somehow landed here, on the same side of something deeper than law. Without a word, she reached into her bag and pulled out a worn, leather-bound book. She extended it to him. "My personal copy of the Constitution," she said. 37 years on the bench. It's been with me through every ruling. I think it should live with someone who made me remember what it actually means. Dante took the book slowly, almost reverently. He opened it, notes scribbled in the margins, highlights faded with time. It was more than a book. It was a passing of the torch. He looked at her, eyes soft. "Thank you." She gave a faint smile. "No, Mr. Cole, thank you." And then she turned and left, quietly, the way she came. Outside, the street was buzzing with life, but inside that community centre, something greater had begun. Not just the lessons, not just the knowledge. A new chapter, one built not from power but from purpose. The midday sun cast a golden glow on the side of the old brick building, now alive with colour and purpose. Brushes moved rhythmically across the wall, youthful hands guided by vision, not just paint. A mural was taking form, bold and breathtaking. At its centre stood the towering figure of Dante Cole, his likeness rendered with careful detail, eyes full of focus, one hand raised with a law book, the other resting gently on his brother Marcus's shoulder. Both men stood side by side, not just as family, but as symbols of something far bigger than themselves. Surrounding them were rays of light in shades of gold and crimson, reaching outward into a sky of deep blue, hope etched into every stroke. Beneath the figures, children kneeled with brushes and chalk, carefully inscribing the words that Dante had once spoken in a crowded classroom. Don't wait for justice. Learn it. Speak it. Live it. Passers-by stopped and stared, some snapping photos, others simply watching in silence. A few recognized Dante and gave him nods, handshakes, or quiet thanks. But he didn't stand in the center of the attention. He stood back beside Marcus, watching the wall fill with life and legacy. In the corner of the crowd stood Judge Wexler, unnoticed but deeply present. No robe, no bench, just a woman humbled by what had unfolded and grateful to witness the continuation of it. A small child asked Dante, "Is that really you on the wall?" He smiled. "It's all of us. Anyone who chooses to speak when others stay silent." The final strokes dried in the sun, the paint now part of the building, the story now part of the city. Narration. He wasn't a lawyer by degree, but in a courtroom of assumptions, he practiced something far rarer. Truth with courage. And then, the final line, quiet but resonant, echoing not through microphones but in memory. The judge forgot the law, but he reminded her of justice.